Come see us do stand-up in Baltimore, Hartford, Syracuse, Atlantic City, Levittown, New York, Cohoes, New York, Providence, Rhode Island, and San Jose, California. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for the tickets. So Donald Trump made a big stink last night about how he brought free speech back to America. Now, what I say about free speech is that, I don't think Elon Musk is a free speech warrior. I don't think so. I think he's happy to suppress when he has to for his own interests, right? But it's not as bad as it was, right? So that's what I say for people like me who wanted to tell the truth about COVID. I was allowed to tell the truth about COVID. I was allowed to tell the truth about Syria. I was allowed to tell the truth about Ukraine. So it was a big deal for me. But no, I don't. In fact, Steve Bannon was on the show and he made the same point. He's not a, he's a tech. He wants to be a tech overlord. He doesn't really care about free speech. But Donald Trump is convinced people that they're for free speech because they're for certain speech, right? But here's the bad part. He put this out, I think, yesterday. He said all federal funding will stop for any college, school, or university that allows illegal protest. Agitators will be imprisoned or permanently sent back to the country from which they came. American students will be permanently expelled or, depending on the crime, arrested. No masks. So you're not allowed to wear a mask, so they can now digitally identify you and put you in a database. Thank you for your attention to this matter, which sounds very scary. In fact, what this is a response to is, him being everybody in government, including Donald Trump. The way he talked to Zelensky is the way a lot of MAGA wants him to talk to Netanyahu. So this is all about his subservience to Adelson. It's about his subservience to Israel. And so this organization, FireOrg, we defend and promote free speech for all Americans in our courtrooms, on campuses, and our culture. They had a couple of tweets about it. And they say the First Amendment protects controversial political speech. We don't use the law to punish dissenters. Instead, as a nation, we have chosen a different course to protect even hurtful speech on public issues to ensure that we do not stifle public debate. They go on to say, as FIRE knows all too well from our work defending students and faculty rights under the Obama and Biden administrations, threatening schools with the loss of federal funding will result in a crackdown on lawful speech. Schools will censor first and ask questions later. Today's message will cast an impermeable chill on students' protests about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, paired with President Trump's 2019 executive order adopting an unconstitutional definition of anti-Semitism and his January order threatening to deport international students for engaging in protected expression. Students will rationally fear punishment for wholly protected political speech. Now, we already talked about at the top of the show, Matt, about your great work exposing the industrial complex, the censorship industrial complex, and you're very sensitive to this because you're a leading journalist, and you've had the IRS try to intimidate you into not saying certain things, and I've been censored. I've been, my own tax dollars have been used to sponsor Vox Ukraine media, which did hit pieces on me to try to get me demonetized and kicked off YouTube. So I'm sensitive to that. And so Trump might want to protect certain speech, but now he's doing this, which is just the opposite. And so you being sensitive to something like this, how would you respond to it?
Well, I'm against it. I mean, when he signed the executive order, and then there was the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that got passed last year, and then this thing this year, which is really just an extension of that. It's, to me, a clear First Amendment issue. Normally what they would do, right? Like if you wanted to be a really aggressive about Palestinian protesters and stay within the letter of the law, you wouldn't say that we're throwing you out of the country because of your protests, right? They would round people up who had committed crimes, and then they would deport them, which is what they're doing in other areas. But you can't say that you're doing it for that reason. I think the Trump, by doing this, is making a huge political mistake, or a potentially huge one. The Democrats have gifted the First Amendment to the Republicans.
Yes.
For a generation, really. I mean, like they were so bad on this issue that they could run on this forever. All they have to do is just show basic respect for the institution, and this is, it's clearly not in the spirit of the First Amendment. You have organizations like FIRE that I think fought very bravely for speech when the ACLU wouldn't, and they're now turning on Trump. That's not what they want. I think they have to be more cognizant of what they have here. I think J.D. Vance is somebody who understands the speech issue and is more instinctively in tune with it. But they have a blind spot about this one issue, and that's unfortunate.
The problem is, Matt, is that the Democrats agree with them.
Well, right. I was about to say that, like, the reason that you're not going to get pushback from the other side on this is, you watch that 60 Minutes segment. Those exact same laws are the ones that got Roger Waters in trouble, right? For advocating for Palestinians. Really what they just do is they define anybody who supports the Palestinian cause as being pro-Hamas or for advocating terrorism, and then it's any one of a dozen different laws that can come into play at that point. They went after all sorts of politicians in the UK for being quote-unquote anti-Semitic, when really what they were doing was protesting the behavior of the Israeli government. Palestinians are often kind of the canary in the coal mine for speech offenses. Like, they're kind of the first people who they try out some new horrible tactic on because they have no lobby. But that's it. But you're absolutely right. There is nobody on the other side who's going to stand up and say you're really wrong about this.
So Caitlin Johnstone tweeted out, she said, if you support freedom of speech, you now have an ethical obligation to oppose Israel, even if you didn't before. Western government support for Israel is the biggest threat to free speech in our society today. Civil rights are being stomped out throughout the Western world to protect Israel information interests. And speech is being suppressed in support of Israel more aggressively than with any other topic. We're not seeing this level of all-out warfare against free expression in any other area. So,
I disagree with her about that, though.
How?
Yeah.
What?
Well, I mean, for instance, the Europe. Look, Israel is not. They're terrible on speech, right? They have been going back to 2015 to 2016. Glenn Greenwald did a story about how Facebook had to make a deal with the Mossad in order to operate in Israel, and how they abided by, I think it was 95% of their recommendations. But absolutely the most dangerous thing right now with speech is the European Union, which has already passed a law called the Digital Services Act, which is a comprehensive official censorship law that mandates that every platform abide by the recommendations of thousands of these credentialed content reviewers called trusted flaggers. They have to be in agreement with them, or else they suffer crippling penalties and go out of business. And that law is the model for what they want to impose everywhere in the world. They've done it pretty much everywhere in every Western democracy except the United States. And yes, Israel's bad, but Europe has already imposed the model for like a true dystopian kind of speech control, that can be imposed at scale. So I'm more scared of that than I am of Israel, but I understand her position.
So the threat that Trump is making is that he will defund colleges of federal funds. And here's a brief video from Glenn Greenwald to explain why that's incorrect. That's an unconstitutional position. Let's listen. What is going on? Okay, here we go.
Universities, or there should be, that's independent of the free speech point, which is that once the federal government or any government decides to offer a benefit that's optional, it doesn't have to provide it, but it decides it's going to, it cannot then condition receipt of that benefit on you're expressing a particular view, you're affirming a particular view, or you're refraining from expressing a political view. And this is basic First Amendment doctrine. Yet all these people defending the Trump administration's attack on these universities for allowing anti-Israel protests are saying, oh, obviously it's not a First Amendment violation to deny federal funding of a university because the government doesn't have to provide funding to universities in the first place. It's true, the federal government doesn't have to provide funding to universities. But once it decides to do so, it cannot then punish the universities by withdrawing that funding only for universities that allow a particular view to be expressed or a particular type of protest to take place and not any other. That is a clear violation of the First Amendment. There's so many court cases on this. There have been efforts, for example, to deny property tax exemptions to people who refuse to sign a vow saying they're not in favor of overthrowing the government of the United States, saying, oh, you only get a property tax exemption if you sign a no saying you don't support the overthrow of the United States government. But people who sign that loyalty pledge to the U.S. government will get property tax exemptions. Obviously, you don't have to provide the property tax exemptions, but the Supreme Court said once you do, you can't condition it on a loyalty with the United States government because that is a violation of free speech. There have been all kinds of other cases like that where there's funding to legal aid lawyers, and they try to say if you're a lawyer and you challenge any welfare reform laws in American courts, you will be ineligible for receiving legal aid. The only lawyers who can get legal aid funding from the government are those who support welfare reform or who stay silent on about it. The court has denied that is unconstitutional. There was an effort to say any news outlet, public media company that gets federal funding has to refrain from editorializing about anything. The minute they try to editorialize about something, they lose their federal funding. The Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional as well. That's because once you offer a benefit, you can't then deny that benefit as punishment for a particular view. And it's so obvious that that has to be the principle. Just consider this hypothetical. The US government, or let's say a state government, opts to provide unemployment benefits to people who get fired, lose their job. Obviously, it doesn't have to provide unemployment benefits. It decides that it's going to. Imagine a law enacted by a state, say Massachusetts, that said, if you support Donald Trump or express support for the Republican Party, you will be ineligible to receive unemployment benefits. The only people eligible to receive unemployment benefits are those who take an oath to support the Democratic Party. Everybody would immediately understand why that's unconstitutional. And yet, you could justify that law based on the same distortion, the same warped rationale as is being offered for the Trump administration's actions this week, which is, oh, look, the government doesn't have to give you unemployment benefits, so you can't claim that it's a violation of your constitution if the government takes unemployment benefits away from you. And the obvious answer is the state has the right to terminate unemployment benefits programs for everybody if it wants, but it can't withdraw them or deny them as punishment for a particular view, nor can it condition receipt or the right to have those benefits on affirming a particular view. So the fact that federal funding is optional doesn't mean the government has the constitutional right to deny it to certain universities that allow a certain type of protest. This is all independent of, by the way, of the creepy phrase that Trump officials, that President Trump used to justify these attacks to serve pro-Israel donors, which is, oh, we're just going after illegal protests. What is an illegal protest? Obviously, if somebody breaks the law, they're going to get arrested. There have been hundreds or thousands of protesters on college campuses throughout 2024, including huge numbers of Jewish students who were protesting the Israeli war in Gaza. They got arrested. But there's such thing as an illegal protest. And if you're going to deny federal funding based on quote unquote permitting an illegal protest, you can't just have that be the case for hate speech against Jews or hate speech against Israel. It would have to be applied universally. Otherwise, it's clearly unconstitutional as an attempt to punish institutions for permitting a certain kind of protest expressing a view that this current government dislikes. This is not controversial. This is not in dispute. It's entirely clear. There are multiple Supreme Court cases on it. Just common sense tells you that you can't condition the receipt of a benefit on the requirement to affirm a certain view, nor can you withdraw that benefit as punishment for expressing another view consistent with the First Amendment.
So, I remember when I was at the Rescue the Republic, by the way, I mean, I'm sure everybody would agree with what he's saying. I don't think, like he said, it's not controversial. And, you pointed out that this is a real blind spot for the Trump administration. I don't know if it's a blind spot or it's just him intentionally serving his donors and the AIPAC lobby, because the AIPAC lobby has the ability to, make him lose his control of the Senate and the House, right? So he's serving, as Bob Dylan said, you got to serve somebody. And so that's who he's serving. I think he's doing it consciously, and I think he knows it's a contradiction to his free speech stance. But when I was at the Rescue the Republic, and you make the point, it's politically disastrous, I think, for Donald Trump to do this. It would make him look like much a stronger man if he allowed protests to happen and just kind of make fun of it if he wants, or kind of point out how it's un-American or how they don't, whatever you want to do. But he should tolerate it because it makes him look weak and authoritarian, because that's what it is. And when I was at the Rescue the Republic, I made a strong defense of, you have to, freedom of speech means freedom of speech that you hate. And if it includes pro-Palestinian protesters, because if they can take the rights of them away, they can take ours away. And that's what this is all about. We're all here because we had our freedom of speech taken away during COVID or another way, and people cheered. And so that was Donald Trump's audience. They cheered that. Right. And I saw people in the audience, lots of MAGA people who are pro-Palestine or not pro-Israel. They had, pro-Palestine posters in their hands at that Rescue the Republic rally. So, I mean, do you see? I mean, I see this as, how do you see this playing out?
Well, I've given up a long time ago trying to figure out Trump's political strategies. Every time I think he does something that is politically disastrous that he'll never recover from, somehow it works out in a way that's different than I expected. I do feel very strongly that they should not be punting away the good the good standing they've gotten on the speech issue. They've fought hard to be taken seriously on that issue, and people like Jim Jordan and Rand Paul have gone through a lot of grief for the Republican Party to be taken seriously on this issue. Just to throw it away on this, and I find it's very hard to believe that this is a calculation that's meant to guarantee control of the House and Senate. Trump, I think, has always understood that his support is really his voters. That's his base. So if he's making that calculation, it's a wrong calculation. But sometimes he will do things like this, it seems to me, in defiance of the law openly, because he wants people to see that he's willing to cross a line in a certain direction. I know I don't agree with him on this one, but there are times when he will do that. But otherwise, this is illogical to me, and I think it's a perilous thing for the party. Like, the other stuff that he's doing in terms of these mass cuts and these other drastic changes that he's making, some of which are probably not going to survive legal challenge, he needs the absolute support of his voters in order to see that through. And if it falls apart because of something like this, then there's then he's got nobody but himself to blame, I would say.
And just to put a button on this, Fire says, if the college violates anti-discrimination laws like Title VI or Title IX, the government may ultimately deny the institution federal funding by taking it to federal court or via notice to Congress and an administrative hearing. It is not simply a discretionary decision that the president can make. Likewise, students who engage in misconduct must still receive due process, whether through a campus or criminal tribunal. This requires fair, consistent application of existing law or policy in a manner that respects students' rights. President Trump needs to stand by his past promise to be a champion of free expression. That means for all views, including those his administration dislikes. So, we'd like to see that. It's I haven't seen anybody do it in my lifetime. And the problem is that the opposition party agrees with what he's doing and saying. And so there will be no, powerful opposition to it except grassroots, right?
Right. And, not everybody in the world is a First Amendment lawyer, right? So the nice thing, this particular branch of First Amendment law can get pretty weedsy for some folks, and it extends into places where even sometimes I roll my eyes at it. Like, for instance, the business with the AP credentials, like that falls under the same principle. Like, if you're going to give credentials to anybody, you can't deny them because AP doesn't use the words Gulf of America. Now, I don't think that like credentials matter. I think journalists who whine about credentials are pussies, and I find the whole issue kind of laughable. But if they took it to court, AP would win. I think you'd have to concede that. But I don't see that as a crime against humanity. But on the other stuff, like denying federal funding to colleges over Palestinian protests, like you can't do that, because that will undermine any claim that he has to being a champion of the First Amendment.
Come see us do stand-up in Baltimore, Hartford, Syracuse, Atlantic City, Levittown, New York, Cohoes, New York, Providence, Rhode Island, and San Jose, California. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for the tickets.